Our content at Southeastern 16 is presented by FanDuel. Find live odds to each and every game, along with futures, things like football championship winners, conference winners, and more. Just to look at a couple of the odds on favorites for the NCAA football title this year. Again, find all that and more, FanDuel.com. Billy Jones alongside John Whittle. John, obviously been kind of a roller coaster the last 4 years for South Carolina. Some really high highs with Shane Beamer, but I think 2 years also. You look at last year and the last year with Spencer Rattler, where they come in with high expectations. Injuries, along with some other stuff, have kind of derailed seasons. I don't mean to start too large here, but what's kind of been the feeling around Shane Beamer's tenure so far?
Well, I mean, you kind of touched on it. I mean, calling it a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, I would say that, South Carolina exceeded expectations, Shane Beamer's first couple of years, and then took a step back in his third. And then, the 2024 season was the first year with Lenora Sellers starting at quarterback. It was, got off to a little bit of a slow start, but really got going there towards the end and ended up being a really great season, setting expectations super high for last year. And, that was one of the most disappointing seasons. South Carolina's had plenty of 4-8 records or sub 500 records before, but, that was one of the most disappointing seasons, relative to expectations in school history last year, just going 1-7 in the SEC and 4-8 overall. So extremely disappointing last year. And I do think that there are with regards to Shane specifically, there are a lot of people around here who are, even though there's a lot of anticipation going into this season, I think there's a lot of folks who are just kind of waiting and seeing before and getting too super high. There have been some areas that have just been really disappointing for the Gamecocks in general, for the entire Shane Beamer era. And you've mentioned there have been a couple of seasons where, things just haven't gone quite right. But, I think there's a lot of wait and see going into this season.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. If you don't mind, I'd love to start on defense. Obviously, Clayton White's been a fixture and has put together some really solid units. Last year, rightfully so, people were raving about what this unit could be with Dylan Stewart. But, man, they lost so much from what they had on that 24 team that it felt like it was going to be tough to replace top to bottom. This year, a lot of new guys coming in, but you bring back the two linebackers in Johnson and Okoronkwo. But some transfers that I think should have you feel really excited, and some experienced guys too on the back end. I'm curious how you kind of seen this defense shaping up outside of Dylan Stewart, who we certainly can get to later.
Yeah, and you touched on it for sure. Like last year, there was so much lost from that 2024 season, especially when you look at the defensive line, and that's so important in this league, as you know, and you lose your top three, or at least three, probably four interior players from the previous season. You lose Kyle Kennard, the major trophy award winner. I think that the expectations for last year's defense as a whole were just a little bit too high. And this year, I don't know if they're maybe high enough, if we're being honest. I think this year's defense could be really, really strong. You mentioned some pieces that they've added. They bring so much back from the year before. And it was a pretty good defense. It was a solid defense. It wasn't anything that was elite last year, certainly not like 2024. But you bring back a lot of your interior defensive linemen, and you added so many from the portal. You bring back Dylan Stewart. To me, you've got a couple of question marks. Your defensive ends, your edge rushers. This past spring, hardly any of them were healthy. And how good are those guys going to come back? You've got some questions. It's your backup cornerback spots. You got a little bit of youth at safety, but you've got a lot of talent there. So I feel like there are a few questions on defense that have to be answered, but I do think that there's some really good talent there for Clayton White to work with, and some experience to go along with it.
Yeah, but you mentioned some of those question marks, but golly, like you just look at the talent. Obviously you got Judge Collier on one side at cornerback, but Bakari Swain, we've seen him flash the speed at returner. What kind of player could he be? You mentioned inside. One guy I'm really excited to see is Tommy Durajaye. Did I say that name right? From Illinois? He was fantastic last year.
Tomawa, yeah. You got the last name right, pretty better than I can get it. So cap tip to you. But yeah, I mean, but yeah, and I don't know if you were done asking about the defensive tackles in general, but yeah, I mean, he's one to circle. Gabriel Brownlow Dindy is one that I really like, who's back for his second year in the program, had a really solid season last year. Troy Pikes is another that I'm extremely excited about. Jordan Thomas, a interior transfer, big 310 pounds, 6'5" nose tackle type, who's coming in from Georgia in his first year. Like I love that defensive tackle position, and when you feel that way going into a season, like that's something to really like and feel good about.
In terms of this defense elevating from being a decent unit to being a really great unit in this league, what kind of player does Dylan Stewart need to be, or is it about the other 10 guys really stepping up?
Well, you hope that it's about you hope that you've got 11 there, because with Dylan, I mean, I love Dylan Stewart, and he could be a top 10 pick, but he played hurt a lot the end of last season, really the back half of last season, took off the entire – I say took off. He was rehabbing for the entire spring, had some surgery right after the season, rehabbing the entire spring. I mean, it was the end of spring practice, and Shane Beamer was talking about how, we've had to kind of reset a little bit. He's not allowed to do any kind of weight training. He's like on complete rest. And you don't really want to hear that in April. I mean, your preseason camp is starting in August, and if you're not touching any weights or doing anything, like, not only are you not doing any football stuff, you're losing. I mean, you're losing your athletic ability by not being able to do anything at all. So he's back in the weight room. He's getting some work in. He's progressing. What does it look like on September 1st, or, that first week of the season? What does it look like on, September 30th, or, when you're a third of the way through? Like, to me, if you're having to hang your hat on one guy, kind of like last year's team was having to, but if you're kind of having to hang your hat on one guy, and that one guy has been so limited, and you've got some question marks on exactly what his physical health is going to look like, that's not a good place to be. So, and I bring up some of the other guys who were hurt. I mean, George Wilson missed the entire spring, and Kobe Saku-Pra is out for the year. There was one or two other guys who missed some significant time at that edge position. You had a true freshman in Julian Walker. You've got Anthony Addison, who had a really nice spring. You've got a few guys there. You got a transfer in, and Drew Collins and Caleb Herring from Tennessee who practiced, and I think they've really got to have him have a good year. There's some other options there. Obviously, no one nearly as transformative as Dylan Stewart. I've got some question marks there, but you got to have 11 out there. I don't know, especially early in the year, that Dylan's going to be able to carry you too much.
On the other side, looking at offense, everyone, understandably wants to go to the quarterback and talk about Lenoris Sellers. And I'm interested to see, just imagine it's been tough on him. This is now going to be his third offensive coordinator in 3 years. Now, Kendall Briles obviously has done a great job at every stop he's been, but a lot of question marks. I think certainly the talent's not an issue. But you look at Nitro Tuggle coming in at wide receiver after a nice season at Purdue, replacing the entirety of the offensive line. And obviously at running back, you're going to ask more from Matt Fuller, and Christian Clark comes over for Texas. What, in your opinion, John, is the biggest part of seeing this offense be successful next year?
Well, it's all going to start up front with that offensive line, and that to me is the biggest been kind of detriment for Shane Beamer in his entire tenure with the Gamecocks. I mean, this is year 6, and you could make the argument that 2 years ago was a solid offensive line. I mean, it wasn't special, but it was pretty good. But Lenoris made a lot out of nothing in a lot of those instances as well, and had some weapons out there that he could rely upon. So, South Carolina has been at or near the bottom of the SEC in sacks allowed and tackles for loss allowed ever since Shane Beamer stepped on campus, and that's not a good place to be. And that's not all offensive line, obviously, and Shane Beamer is incredibly quick to point out that there's tight ends out there, there's wide receivers, there's running back, there's quarterbacks who are making mistakes and bad reads, and but everybody's got that too. Like, not when you start looking at those sack totals, everybody's got tight ends that make some mistakes, and everybody's got some quarterbacks that make some mistakes. So yeah, like, it's a big deal for South Carolina. And I wrote this past off season on Gamecocks 24/7 that you had to have dropped. You really needed to change and overhaul this entire offensive line from top to bottom. And that's really what happened. I mean, it started with the offensive line coach, and really you can say offensive coordinator too, but offensive line coach, one of his assistant offensive line coaches, down into the recruiting ranks too. So they let go a lot of offensive linemen. And I'm not saying that some of these offensive linemen aren't talented. There's several who went to Power 4 programs and who I think are going to have good years. But when something is that systemically bad, sometimes you've just got to cut out all of the pieces and get right down to the bottom and start over. Just tear it all completely down and rebuild it from the foundation. And that's what happened this offseason in terms of you bring in a new offensive coordinator. He brings in his offensive line coach with him, his handpicked offensive line coach. You go out and bring in so many guys into the portal. You hang on to just a couple and just a few, and go from there. And that, to me, and how all that can function and operate is going to be the biggest deal. Like, does South Carolina have the most dynamic wide receivers in the league? Certainly not. Do they have one of the best stables of running backs? Probably not, although I do like a few more than maybe some of the others, than some of the other pundits around the league. South Carolina does have a great quarterback and does have some potential at tight end, but those guys aren't going to be able to function if this offensive line continues to operate like Shane Beamer's has. But I think it's going to be better. I think Kendall Browse's offense is going to help mask maybe some of the lesser pieces or lesser abilities. But South Carolina is going to be good offensively. I know it sounds really cliche to say it starts up front, but with South Carolina having been so bad at it for so long, I think it's certainly fair to say that South Carolina is going to have to be just so much better at that position group to be able to talk about a functioning offense.
And what do you think, kind of, if the offensive line is good? And certainly, like, you look at some of the names, Jacarius Peak. I know there was the issue. Did he get injured in a basketball tournament? Was that the story I read?
They had a little team building. I mean, it was a team activity. Basketball, I think it was 3-on-3. It may have been 5-on-5, but a little basketball event. And some of these new practice facilities have basketball courts in there. Like some want to get mad at Shane Beamer for having a sanctioned basketball game. And part of me gets it, but then part of me is like, it also promotes athletic ability too, right? Like, so,
right.
Stuff's going to happen, and you just hope it doesn't happen to a left tackle you paid a whole bunch of money for, who has first round pick potential. Like, you hope that doesn't happen, just like you hope your Friday night starter doesn't have to have Tommy John surgery, or your starting point guard, doesn't roll his ankle. But that's a question mark there, though. Like, you bring up Jacarius, like, if your left tackle is out for, I mean, he's another one of those guys who missed the entire spring, is limited in the summer, and is going to be kind of iffy as we sit here today for that opening game. And how's he going to look that opening game? When's he going to be 100%? Like, it's easier for a wide receiver to get a knee healthy than it is for an offensive lineman, because you're 180 pounds walking around at wide receiver, whereas you're 325 when you're walking around as an offensive lineman. So that's certainly a big deal, and they're going to have to move some pieces and parts around. I mean, I already think there's a little bit of concern about depth on the offensive line, but that sort of happens too when you build from the ground up.
We've talked about kind of how this offense avoids being good. If they do get solid offensive line play, and if Sellers stays healthy, what's the ceiling, do you think, on this unit, especially if Kendall Briles can kind of dial up the magic we've seen him put together a couple of times in the past?
Well, I think it's got, top third of the SEC potential. I mean, you come out of 2024 with Lenore Sellers as a redshirt freshman and go into 25 talking about him being a Heisman Trophy candidate. I mean, he wasn't a favorite. He wasn't a top 3 or 5 kind of guy necessarily, at least by odds makers. But you're talking about him as a top 10 guy in the Heisman Trophy race going into last year. I mean, he's got that type of potential. I mean, you've still got people picking him as a, top 10 kind of NFL draft pick this coming spring. So, when you have a quarterback who can play at that high of a level, especially one that's a little bit multifaceted, can run a little bit, has a big arm, and he has a quarterback coach and play caller who is experienced and shown that he can produce a college offense as well as Kendall Briles can. I think that's a big deal. You also look at the wide receiver position last year, and I think it was six freshmen that they had playing last year. I mean, obviously, they weren't all in the rotation at the same time, but you had a bunch of new guys who were playing at wide receiver. And, those guys have been through it now. Nick Harbor's been through it now again, and he's got the same wide receiver coach back in Mike Furry. Mazio Bennett has made some real strides forward, and you mentioned bringing in a guy like Nitro Tuggle. Like, I mean, there's some weapons out there for him at wide receiver, and I'm not huge on the tight end room, but I also think that you've got enough wide receivers out there who can be really good to balance that out. And then at running back, I think Matthew Fuller had a huge spring, and Christian Clark, kind of pushed him a little bit too, especially there at the end. I feel better about that position than I thought I would. And, you've got Isaiah Augustave and Jawarn Howell there too, who have played some college football before. So, I feel pretty good about the pieces around Lenore's from a skills standpoint. And, if he can kind of find that swagger again that he had in 24, the back half of that season, we've seen the skill set. There's obviously a lot that he can do to improve as a passer that we saw at the end of the 24 season. But he's got kind of a little bit of that it factor when you need a play made, right? Like he's one of those guys who can figure it out in the moment. And just having him play confident and play a little bit loose and play a little bit free, he just looked so rigid and mechanical at times last season and just kind of scared to make a play. And I don't think we're going to see that this year.
We talked a little bit about the yo-yo act. Maybe that's a harsh description, but the last 4 years, there's certainly been some fluctuation. What kind of season would Carolina need to have? Maybe it's a win total. Maybe it's a game or two on their schedule that fans would like to see them win. That would constitute a successful season.
I mean, it's a great question, and it's really hard to quantify because, if like if Dylan Stewart and Jacarius Peak don't play a meaningful role this year, like, I mean, those are two potential first round draft picks right there who you could be missing. And, you know, I think both of them are going to be able to play and both are going to be able to get back to playing at a high level, but you never know with the kind of injury that Dylan Stewart has. And you don't ever really know with the offensive lineman and his knee. So, you know, it's a little bit of a question mark, but at the same time, like if things go really well, South Carolina could have like 4, even 5 guys drafted in the first round or top 50 picks. And if you're talking about that, like you're talking about some really high-end talent that South Carolina doesn't usually have. So if you have a 6-6 or 7-5 type of season with that kind of talent, that's going to be really, really disappointing. And, you know, so I hate to sit here and say, especially with what South Carolina is historically, that 7-5 would be a disappointing year, but 7-5 would be a disappointing year. Like, I mean, 8-4 is something you got to shoot for in the regular season or more than that. Like South Carolina was talking about playoffs last year going into that season. This team's better than last year. And, you know, so that, I mean, that puts you up at 9-3 just to be into that conversation. So, I mean, in 10-2 to feel really good about getting there. So, I mean, you're really wanting a big year from the South Carolina team. You know, I hate to kind of put a ceiling on it, or I hate to put a floor on it too. But I'll say this: if you don't win more than 7 games, you know, you're coming out of 2025 feeling really disappointed if you're a Gamecock fan. You know, 8-4, you can probably get your head around because you look at the back half of the year, and you know, I'm not saying that what we see right now is like going to be what it is at the end, but after your bye week, you play 6 and then 6. You look, and Tennessee's top 25, and Oklahoma's top 25, and Texas A&M's top 25, and Georgia's, I mean, top couple, and then you got Clemson at the end with Arkansas mixed in. I mean, that's difficult, but you know, it's always going to be difficult. So I don't know. Like, I mean, I feel like if you're a South Carolina fan, you got to be sitting there pulling hard to win at least 9 games. And, you know, certainly 7 or less is disappointing.
If they do get to that 8-win, maybe even 9-win threshold, what's the most pivotal game for them to win? And what player position group really needs to show up this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple, right, to me that you circle. Like South Carolina, the front half of the schedule is a lot more manageable, right? Like, I mean, you just had the schedule up there a second ago. There's Kent State and then Towson and then Mississippi State at home. You got at Alabama, which is obviously going to be a bear, and then Kentucky at home. But, you know, I think the 2 games that kind of surround the bye week are the ones that I think determine a lot of how this season is going to go. You go down to Florida, you know, for your 6th game in 6 weeks to play at Florida, and you know, who knows what that team's going to look like down there. And then you have your bye week and come off of your bye week, and Tennessee's waiting for you on the other side at home. And you know, that back half of the schedule, as we just went through, is going to be tough. But you know, you've got to be able to beat Tennessee at home if you want to have the kind of year that you really want to have, and you got to beat Florida on the road if you're going to have the kind of year that you really want to have. Because you know, if you don't win that Tennessee game, it certainly doesn't get easier the next week when you have to travel out to Oklahoma. And you know, I just think that those 2 games that are surrounding the bye week is just incredibly important for the Gamecocks. That Florida game and that Tennessee game. You know, if you don't win those, it's going to be really difficult to be where you want to be in the end.
And as far as player position group, what do you think's the most pivotal this year?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about the offensive line, so we'll leave that one be. But I think the secondary on defense, like you mentioned, Judge Collier, and I love Bakari Swain. But you know, behind that is a little bit of a question mark, and then you look at that safety position, and Peyton Williams has played a lot of football, and I think he elevated his game from his sophomore year to his junior year last year in terms of, being able to make a few more plays, cause a few more turnovers, just being around the football a little bit more. But, to me, he's not like a dynamic top of the line SEC safety. And then you look beside him and wonder who's going to win that spot beside him. So to me, that safety position is a little bit of a question mark, and the depth there at that cornerback position. So, I do think there are guys. We just don't know who's going to emerge yet. But I think I've got tremendous trust in Torian Gray as the defensive backs coach. He's done a phenomenal job and always kind of pieces it together and gets those guys coached up. But there's some young guys in that secondary, like a Kendall Daniels, like a David Busey, who's played some, a DeMarcus Leach, those Koski Barnes, Jazavian Currents. Those are some guys who, like, I think I think those are going to be a little bit more of a household name around, the South Carolina parts if South Carolina's had a successful defense.
Well, John, appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on.